I want to start with this map here, which brings in Texas after it's annexed and joins the United States. And I want to emphasize for you guys something that I emphasize in my survey classes at UNT, which is the annexation of Texas is a true remaking of North America. It changes the maps in profound ways, not least of which because I mean it becomes the westernmost outpost of the United States just for a short time, because disputes about what is Texas and who owns and controls it between the United States and Mexico leads to, that cataclysmic war from 1846 to 48, or as it's called in Mexico, the War of 47, that ultimately leads to the Mexican cession, right? All this land between Texas and California is 500,000 square miles of territory that ultimately is going to be at the seed of the fights that lead to the American Civil War, the future of the nation, whether it becomes slave or free, that all comes back to what happens in Texas. And so this question of annexation is really crucial. And it's deeply centered in not just what happens in Texas, but in the United States and Mexico. You can't understand the continent unless you understand this. One of the things I want to posit for you guys is that you therefore have to understand cotton and slavery during this time period to understand how Texas ended up both being annexed and what that meant for the United States and ultimately both the United States and Mexico. Right. So the central question I want to run through this presentation, and I want to run through our conversations about this, is why? Why is slavery so consistently and powerfully a shaper of Texas in this whole period? From the Republic era, which is where we're going to start today, really, through annexation, it's at the center of that, and then into the 1850s, which I'm not really going to get into, but I'm going to set up for the presentations that follow us, right? I think this is a thread we can have with our students that helps them understand how these historical events tie together and build on things that came before, right? The fights over annexation don't come out of nowhere. They come from this long history that's tied to cotton production and slavery in the region. And understanding those connections is really crucial, right? So the background to this is stuff that you guys would have covered when you're talking about Texas in the 1820s and early 1830s with cotton expanding across North America in such rapid and powerful fashion, right? It begins with the cotton revolution of really the 18 teens, where you see this map right here of people pouring into the Mississippi River Valley by the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, so that by the early 1820s, you have, 370,000 people who moved into Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana alone to grow cotton, right? Because the British Empire is buying cotton, paying top dollar or top pound, as I like to say, for cotton to anyone who can grow it. And so the American South, the Deep South, becomes this part of American expansion in a rapid fashion during the 18 teens and 1820s as cotton plantation districts and farming spreads across the Mississippi River Valley in a massive way, right? That's the background to what brings Anglo-Americans into Texas in the 1820s. When we talk about Stephen F. Austin, what we're really talking about is the further expansion of Mississippi westward into Mexico, beyond American borders, moving into northeastern Mexico, where Anglo-Americans wanted land for cotton. And the Mexicans who lived there, the Tejanos, helped support that movement of both cotton and therefore slavery from places like Mississippi, because it was in their personal interest to do so, or at least they perceived it as in their personal interest to do so, right? So during the 1820s and 1830s, leading up to the Texas Revolution, slavery was one of the main points, if not the biggest flashpoint of fighting and debating between those who were settling in Texas and the Mexican government at both state and national levels, all right? That helps lead to the Texas Revolution because it's tied up in ideas of federalism and centralism and the civil war that breaks out within Mexico in 1835 going forward, that we don't have time to fight right now, unfortunately. But in the aftermath of that, the Republic of Texas emerges. And this is a context I would urge you to use with your students, that I use with mine, is that the Republic of Texas, when it emerges, it's a remarkable thing in North America, because the Republic of Texas is the first independent nation outside the United States and also outside of Mexico, made up predominantly of Anglo-Americans, um, dedicated to cotton, dedicated to a cotton empire being constructed in this region. It is, in that sense, everything the Confederacy will later try to become in the 1860s. The Republic of Texas is all of those things in the 1830s and 1840s. It's a place devoted to cotton and therefore slave labor as the underlying engine that makes those cotton fields so deeply profitable. The Confederates don't get their chance to try out that idea because, fortunately, you lose their war. But the Texans do get to try out this idea for 9 whole years. And that's what's so interesting about this. It fails. And annexation is the result of that failure. And so understanding that story helps tie us in from cotton in the 1820s through the fights that happen after Texas comes in the United States in the 1840s into the 1850s about why these things are so important to these Anglos in Texas and the future of this region, right? And I posit, if you think about Texas in this time period and you structure it with your students, think of it as a place devoted to cotton and therefore devoted to slavery. We know it was devoted to slavery because they said it was devoted to slavery. If you read the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, and I know all of you have in great detail, right? You look at the general provisions, section 9, it talks very specifically about how protected slavery is in Texas, which is to say, it's put it behind iron walls. There's no fighting that slavery is going to stay in Texas. You can't outlaw it. The Republic of Texas Congress can't do it. The president of the republic can't do it. The court system can't challenge it. You can't attack slavery in the republic. It's built into the Constitution in a very explicit way, well beyond the U.S. Constitution's protections on slavery. And so when we talk about the TEACs, when we talk about how we structure these things for our students, one of the readiness standards, 7.4b, says, when we talk about this period, analyze the causes and events leading to Texas annexation, such as security and debt, right? And that's what, the TEACs typically point towards, security and debt as those main issues. And they're in there, and we'll talk about that. What I want to tell you is slavery and the cotton economy are actually the bedrock of the problems that lead to issues of security and debt for the Republic of Texas. So behind those concepts is a deeper problem. The fact that Texas declares itself a slaveholders republic and it's devoted to cotton, both of which are going to become problematic for the republic as it goes forward, right? Now, the Texans who write that constitution and declare Texas a slaveholders republic, they think this is going to help lead to prosperity for the republic because in the mid-1830s, what they're saying is this is a place where abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison here on the right, or anti-slavery Northern politicians like John Quincy Adams here on the left, right, cannot threaten slavery. The time Texas becomes an independent republic in the mid-1830s, there's huge fights going on in the United States, particularly in the Congress, over the future of slavery, about slaveholding petitions about Washington, D.C. Garrisonian abolitionism has just emerged. It's become a real hot topic, and it's making slaveholders in the South nervous about anti-slavery sentiment in the United States. Texas stands up and says, hey, we're a slaveholding paradise. We're a slaveholders republic. You can't outlaw it here. These guys aren't allowed in Texas. So by all means, if you're a Mississippi cotton planter or Alabama slaveholder, come to Texas, you'll be safe here, right? So they imagine that this is going to help secure, it's going to provide security for the Republic of Texas by ensuring a migration stream from the United States. But it becomes a long-term problem. And that really is at the epicenter of Texas's failures and challenges as a republic, is that it gets enmeshed, the republic does, in all these fights over slavery and politics in both the United States and the larger Atlantic world, right? So for example, Texas tries to get annexed to the United States as soon as it becomes independent from Mexico. In 1836, they try to get annexed to the United States. Andrew Jackson won't touch it. And so Texas gets rejected at the very beginning over the slavery issue, all right? And you have a lot of anti-slavery, anti-Texas sentiment that emerges in the northern United States during this time period, directly tied to all these fights. And so here's a broadside from Boston that we're going to talk about in the documents section our session at the end of all of this. So we'll get to read this in more detail there. But my point is, Republic of Texas has a PR problem. They can't get friends, and they have a lot of opposition simply because they're so openly devoted to slavery as a means of producing their cotton. Right? This is one of my favorite examples. This is a lithograph that was done in New York during this time period, and it's an anti-Texas cartoon that shows Texas. You can see the caption at the bottom: "Young Texas in repose." That creature there is Texas. Literally perched atop the back of slavery, an enslaved person here. He's been badly whipped with a cat of nine tails, right? This is a fugitive from justice. You can see arm and leg cuffs on this guy. He's gotten out of jail. He's gotten away from getting hung. He's got some tattoos of his evil deeds. On his arm, he's got the words rape, murder, incest, and slavery. And slavery's written 4 or 5 different times up and down his arm, just in case it was too subtle in how it's portraying itself, right? And the reason I put up this cartoon is to demonstrate the public relations issue that Texas had, because when Texas became independent, what it needed more than anything else were international friends. It needed international recognition. It needed other countries to say, you exist, and we'll trade with you and probably lend you money, and that would be a really wonderful thing. One of the biggest problems with that, of course, is that as a slaveholders republic, there were a lot of countries who didn't want to recognize Texas for that very reason. And the leader of all of that was Great Britain. All right. The British are one of the leading anti-slavery nations in the world at this time. They were using their navy to try to stamp out the international slave trade. And so the British were not interested in recognizing the Republic of Texas, which was a real problem for Texas because the British were by far the largest purchasers of international cotton at this time. And so if you can't trade with the British, they also won't loan you money. It makes the Republic, which is weak already, even weaker because it can't get the financial stability it needs to build itself up in any way, shape, or form. So I want to emphasize, during the very first couple of years of the Republic, it starts floundering out the gates, right? Under Sam Houston's administration, the debt increases, no money's coming in, they're not getting international recognition. The United States was the only country that recognized them, and Andrew Jackson does that literally as he's walking out of the White House. So it's not looking too promising here, right? Everyone says, no, hold on, we're okay. We still grow cotton. So there's an international market for that. We'll be good, not a problem. But then the markets crash, right? This is another matter of timing. But y'all have heard, I'm sure, of the Panic of 1837, which starts crashing down all kinds of markets, but it brings cotton prices tumbling down from incredible highs to abysmal lows. It'd be like the price of oil today, just crashing like it has during the pandemic, right into the floor. And it took the Texas economy with it because 95% of the Texas economy during the Republic years was cotton. It's literally the only thing they've got. So when the cotton markets crash with the Panic of 1837, I mean, there's nothing much you can do. No one wants to buy your cotton. No one recognizes you. No one will lend you money. And you can see how this is swirling into the ground, right? So again, when we talk about the Teak standards, right, analyze the causes and events leading to Texas annexation, such as security and debt. Most of that debt was a result of Texas not being able to sell its cotton. And the insecurity that came with being so poor leaves it vulnerable to Mexico in 1842 and otherwise, is again tied to this inability to get international recognition, and inability for them to be able to do what nations can do, which is borrow money, make alliances, and then build up their security from there. They try stopgaps, right? They try everything they can possibly do. They start printing money, which is worth nothing because it's backed by nothing. I always like this $3 bill, by the way, because first off, you can buy stuff on eBay today. It's worth way more today than it was during the Republic period. But you know, they got cotton over here. See this cotton plant in full bloom? They love cotton so much they even put it on their money. They tried taxing their citizens, but nobody had any cash in the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas itself stopped taking its own money in debt. Like you couldn't pay your taxes to the Republic in Republic of Texas money. That's how bad things were, right? So things are kind of spinning into the floor, which I think is important because critiques ask us to identify, you know, the main events and people and whatever of the Houston and Lamar administrations, right? And this is how we often talk about these things. You know, Houston, then Lamar, then back to Houston, and all the events that go on, Santa Fe, the Muir expedition. These are all important things. But what I want to posit to you guys, and I want you to think about with your students, is all that's going on, but both of these presidents are still in the same straitjacket. No one's recognizing you, essentially. You've got no money. Cotton markets have collapsed. What do you do, right? They're both limited. They both try different things, but they both come back to the same place too. That's a very ineffectual government if you can't pay for anything, right? Republic of Texas couldn't even pay its own its own administration salaries in many cases. It was just a hot mess, right? Which is why I always love this image of the first capital of Texas. It didn't look like this at the time necessarily, but it's a good symbol for the situation Texas found itself in. And we know that Texans at the administration level felt that this was the situation because they said it. They said it out loud, right? This is, again, we remind our students of the power of these documents to bring the voices of the people from the era to say it in their own words and see it from their own perspective, right? So this is from a guy named Wash Miller, who was the personal secretary of Sam Houston. When Houston was reelected and became president a second time, you know, Wash is looking at all this in Texas, and he's just, this is the perspective from inside the Houston administration. As you can see, we are without strength and worse than all, without confidence in ourselves. We are in collapse, perfectly prostrate and powerless, right? So the Republic is essentially becoming a failed state, and it's extremely vulnerable. And 1842 is, of course, the year Mexico invaded San Antonio twice, brief expeditions, but it demonstrated the weakness of the Republic. Houston sees all this and he says to himself, all right, we've got to join the United States. Like, there's just no way. That's the only way to salvage this situation. So I want to emphasize to you something that I emphasize to my students. We need to make it clear to our students that Texas approaches annexation from a point of weakness, right? Things are falling apart. Either Mexico or the Comanches are going to take over most of this region. If we're going to get annexed, that might save us, but they're not coming to the United States from a position of strength. They're saying, please help, and we need it right now, right? So Houston starts looking for opportunities to bring back up the annexation possibility that was rejected by the United States in 1836. And so, you know, when he looks at the map here, this is a complicated situation, but something comes up that helps Houston immensely, which is that the British show up. And the British are suddenly interested now in recognizing Texas as an independent country. That's a big shift. You got to remember, the 19th century was the British century, right? Everybody who lived in the Atlantic world lived in a British world at this time. The British were the most powerful nation, the most powerful economic, political, and military force of this particular age. So what they said mattered. The British have been watching the Republic and saying, okay, you guys are a hot mess. Maybe that presents us an opportunity. And the British came up with this idea that if they offered the Texans protection and financial stability, if they recognized Texas as a country and offered to give them loans that would keep their government afloat and their nation alive, maybe they could force, because they'd have leverage, they could force Texas then to give up slavery, right? And this was actually a scheme that was actually written out as, this is my scheme, by several British diplomats, that they sent ideas back to London, and you know, the British government got behind in broad strokes of saying, like, let's experiment with seeing if we recognize Texas, maybe we can force them to give up slavery. Because what the British really wanted was to find a source of cotton that was produced by free labor, right? The British Empire is trying to extricate itself from slavery, but it's got a massive textile industry that just depends heavily on raw cotton, and they're buying a lot of it from Mississippi and Alabama. But they'd love to find cotton that isn't produced by slave labor. Maybe Texas is that solution. And if they can get Texas to get rid of slavery and they get free labor cotton, they could also put a real wrench in the expansion of the American South westward, right? These are all good things from the British perspective. And they're also terrifying things from the American perspective. Because if there's one thing that all Americans, North and South, could agree on at this time, it's that they hate the British. So with all of that, the British Empire approaches Sam Houston. Sam Houston says, that's an interesting proposal there. You know, maybe we would be willing to get rid of slavery. Maybe we would be willing to get rid of this labor system in exchange for preserving Texas and moving on long term. Houston doesn't actually believe that. Houston's just using the British because what he wants to do is scare the United States into being more interested in annexing Texas. So he starts playing nice with the British. The British send a representative to Galveston, a guy named Charles Eliot, that Sam Houston basically greets at the docks and starts running around in bars, drinking with him and getting written up into the newspapers, all to put pressure on the United States, right? And it's all built on this idea. Oh, Charles Eliot was a very big fan of getting rid of slavery in Texas. He actually wrote, "This is my scheme," in his little diary, talking about this very idea. This is all built on the idea that Texans might give up, Anglo-Texans might give up slavery in order to preserve the Republic. Would they have actually done that? Seems highly, highly unlikely. And how do we know this? Well, because there were folks who floated that idea amongst average Texans, right? So this gentleman here, Stephen Pearl Andrews, he's a lawyer from Massachusetts who found himself in the Republic of Texas in the late 1830s, lived in Houston. And in 1839, when all this starts going on, he says to himself, I think maybe Texas might be ready for a anti-slavery party. And so he goes to Galveston to try to drum up support amongst Texans to get rid of slavery, embrace the British proposals of possibly getting rid of slavery. And what happens on Galveston is that he goes door to door trying to knock on doors and get people to come out to a rally. And instead, what happens is a mob shows up and takes him to the edge of Galveston, tosses him in a rowboat and tells him to get out of there or they're going to kill him, right? He goes back to Houston where another mob surrounds his house and he and his family have to escape in the night and run to the United States for safety. It's simply to say, the average Texans had no interest, average Anglo-Texans had no interest in getting rid of slavery because they saw it so deeply tied to cotton. And that's the only thing that the Texas economy seemed to be running on. And so they weren't really going to get rid of slavery. You read the newspapers from this era on the portal of Texas history, they're just overwhelmingly in support of keeping slavery. But this is a diplomatic game. And so the Houston administration starts sending letters to Washington saying, maybe we would give up slavery if we had to. We'd rather be annexed to the United States, but if these British folks are the only salvation you've got, we've got to listen to them, right? Those letters get to Washington and they got into the hands of the John Tyler administration. And Tyler, the Virginian himself, Southerner, is interested in the cotton economy expanding west and general westward expansion of the country, is very interested in this conversation, right? And so there's a long, complicated story here. Short version is Tyler decides basically what Houston wanted him to do. Tyler decides to take this to the United States Congress, puts it in front of the Congress. It's a treaty between the Republic of Texas and the United States. It would need 2/3 of the United States Senate in order to approve that. So in June of 1844, they have a vote in the US Senate to decide if the United States should annex Texas, as John Tyler is hoping that they will. When the vote comes back, you can see it is 2/3, but it's 2/3 the wrong direction, right? There's 35 against and only 16 in favor of annexing Texas, all right? And that's important because this is an overwhelming rejection of annexation in the United States, all right? Northerners by large margins are against this. You're never gonna get over the 2/3 margin if you're already 2/3 behind. This is a really terrible situation for the Republic in hopes of trying to get annexed. And it's all over the slavery issue, right? It's over the question of expansion of slavery in the United States, what that will do to power in the United States Congress. Every state, of course, has 2 senators and at least 1 member of the House, right? And the South getting more power is enough to unite Northerners against that. And there are Southerners who are also afraid this might incite a war with Mexico. So there's Southerners themselves who are concerned about expansion and the consequences that might have for the country. So my point is simply that this looks dead in the water, all right, on every level. in large measure, again, because slavery is so much at the center of both Texas and US politics at this time, right? And it might have been dead. Like if you read the newspapers from this era in Texas, like right after this vote, I mean, it's just like the sky is falling, things are terrible, we're dead. It's going to be pandemonium. But 1844 was a presidential election year, right? And that mattered because things can shift and tides can move very quickly sometimes. And we see this in the case of annexation, right? Because in the aftermath of this, the major parties in the United States who are going to be nominating their candidates for president are going to try to see what are we going to do about this Texas issue. Most everybody thinks it's dead in the water. So the Whigs, right? It's the Whigs and the Democrats at this time. The Whigs nominate their candidate for president, who's once again Henry Clay, the guy who's like William Jennings Bryan. He just runs for president time and time and time again. I love this picture of him. This is later in life. He was considered quite the ladies' man back in the day, but my students like to call him Skeletor now when we get to this point. Henry Clay, he comes out as the Whig candidate. He doesn't want anything to do with this Texas issue. He just wants to put it behind him and move forward. So Clay comes out, and at the very, right at the beginning after he's nominated, he basically says, "We're done with Texas. We're just going to move on. We're all going to forget about it. Let's just roll forward," right? Most people thought that was going to be the case, right? Then the Democrats nominate James K. Polk, whom, the joke was, who's James K. Polk? Most people hadn't heard of him. He's a Tennessean Jackson protege, been governor of Tennessee, which my students like to call the mullet here because the mullet has a proud presidential history, you can see. He comes out and he's a dark horse candidate. Basically, nobody's heard of him. And he does something very clever. He says, no, we're not going to forget about Texas. We're going to annex Texas, re-annex is what he says, Texas, and we're going to take Oregon, right? So here's what everyone can rally around: anti-British sentiment. We keep the British out of Texas and we keep the British out of when Polk, puts this forward as it's a clever to compete with Clay in a way he might not otherwise be able to. And so the election of 1844, which happens in November, is incredibly close, right? And it really comes down to a couple thousand votes. James K. Polk wins, so it's not a landslide, but it's a eking out of a victory. But he wins. And for that, there seems to be, momentum now on actually annexing Texas. And people in Texas are excited about this. People in the United States are a little bit more divided by section. But it seems to be back probably more excited than John Tyler, who is still president and has accomplished very presidency. And we'll still be president till March, because back then we didn't inaugurate our presidents until March. That won't change until the 1930s. So John Tyler says, well, I've still got time to get this done and get credit for it. So he, with the Texas delegation in Washington, D.C., comes up with a zany scheme to try to get Texas annexed while he can still get credit for it. So this gets put back in front of the United States Congress. Once again, because of the slavery issue, because of the divisions between North and South and political power, and the U.S. political system is based on, in many ways, when you expand territory, you expand political power again, because every new state gets, new representation. This got to the core of both Northern and Southern divisions, again, over the expansion of slavery. And so there was just no way you were going to get any Northern votes of significance on annexing Texas, no matter how much anti-British sentiment you tried to bring into play. So they can't get 2/3. So they try a different method. They decide they're going to have a joint resolution of Congress, which is you're going to get both houses, right? House and Senate. They both kind of resolve that this is a good idea by 51%. Is that legal? Yeah. No one says it isn't legal, so we'll give it a shot, is what they decide to do. So they put it into the Congress to get voted on. This happens goes before the House in January of 1845. You can see it's, it's not a razor thin vote, but you couldn't even get 2/3 of the House to be in favor of this one. It wins 120 to 98. And then it goes to the Senate, which votes in February of 1845. And that's a razor thin vote, right? 27 in favor, 25 against. You flip one vote, it's a dead tie. So I always tell my students, if the annexation of Texas looks inevitable in retrospect, it didn't feel that way at the time to anybody who's experiencing any of this, all right? So they offer annexation to Texas, all right? They send a rider from Washington with the offer of annexation as fast as they can get it down there. I'm not going to go through the terms. You guys know this. There's some very basic sort of stuff. It was a good deal for Texas, They get to keep slavery because they come in as a state, not a territory. They had their debt, but they got to keep their public lands. That's the gift that's kept on giving for Texas. And the U.S. promised to enforce the border of Texas down to the Rio Grande, which was in dispute between Republic and Mexico, in ways that'll lead to the U.S.-Mexico War. All right. So Texas accepts because they're thrilled to death. Polk signs the Texas Admission Act at the end of 1845, literally the very end of 1845. And the map changes, right? So we're back to our original map in some ways, right? That this moment, annexation shifts everything overnight, because now you can see Texas is no longer Texas. Texas is the United States of America. But the United States only goes up to the Nueces River, which is the historical boundary of Texas, right? There's this dispute over, does it go all the way down to the Rio Grande, which the Republic had claimed on pretty much no evidence whatsoever, and Mexico disputed every which way from Sunday. So this has shifted the map tremendously, right? So one of the TEAC supporting standards asks us to explain the significance of that date of 1845. And what I would say is this moment changes everything. This changes the map. This changes geopolitical dynamics between the United States and Mexico, right? Because now the United States is claiming land that the Republic had claimed. Except the United States has a government that's functioning and has an army that it can throw at this. The Republic had none of that stuff, right? That leads to the U.S.-Mexico War, 1846 to 1848. It leads then that war to this map. I wish we had time to fight the war, but we just don't. It redraws the boundary between the United States and Mexico in ways that I don't have to remind you, we are still debating and discussing in contemporary politics today, right? And what that border means. And it leads to, again, all this land that comes into the United States. That will be at the center of debates from the 1848 going forward about what happens to that Western land, about the issue of slavery. Is it slave? Is it free territory? Right? From the Wilmot Proviso to the Compromise of 1850 and onward and upward from there. This will be the central point of debate in the United States that will separate North from South and raise paranoia on both sides to the levels that we end up killing each other during the American Civil War over these questions. All of that comes back to Texas, and it comes back to annexation in particular and the circumstances that led to it, right? It opens up Texas to a massive population increase. I know you guys know that, but during the 1850s, annexation of Texas opens the floodgates to Americans who weren't willing to come when it was a part of Mexico or a floundering republic, but are coming now by the hundreds of thousands. This is a terrible graph that I made in Excel, but it shows the population increase overall. Texas from 1847 was 140,000 to by 1860, you're north of 600,000 people and 180,000 enslaved people who've been brought into Texas during that time period, right? When the TEACs ask us to describe how immigration and migration to Texas have influenced it, annexation opens the floodgates to a massive transformation where you have this just flood in of people, almost all of whom are coming from the American South, who grow cotton, right? And then we're back to our original point, right? Cotton is at the backbone of the Texas economy. And so slavery is woven into it from the very word go. Because it's during the 1850s that Texas becomes the leading producer of cotton in the United States. We outstrip Mississippi. We're still the leading producer of cotton in the United States to this day, I might add. Usually us in California vying for that title, right? When we go back to the question of the causes and events leading to Texas annexation, security, debt, yes, but all those things are tied to this basic economy It's built on cotton and slavery, right? And so that is why slavery proves to be such a consistent and powerful shaper. It is woven throughout all of this because it is the economy. It is therefore the political system, and it is therefore at the center of what happens in Texas and the United States, and therefore part of Mexico throughout all of it, right? And that leads again to those fights over what happens to this territory taken from Mexico that will ultimately lead to the American Civil War, which we will talk about more next week with Dr. Baumgardner. He's going to talk about the road to the Civil War and the fights that happened both in Texas and the United States along that pathway there. So with that, I'm going to stop and let's see if we have questions.